Okay, let's unpack this. Picture a nation, Japan, modernizing really fast, right? It's got ministers, a cabinet, even a parliament starting up.
A formal government structure, yeah.
But behind all that, sort of separate, in the imperial court, there's this tiny group. Unelected, no actual legal definition, but wow, they had huge influence. Almost decisive, really, on the biggest things.
A fascinating setup, isn't it? This group was the Oayu, the Genrou, operating in the Empire of Japan before World War II. Think of them as these elder statesmen, but their power came from, prestige and trust, not from any actual law book.
And that's exactly what we want to dig into here, using the history you've laid out as our guide. We're going to explore, what this informal thing really was, who was in it, where did this power, this non-legal power, even come from?
Yeah, and what did they do? Beyond just sort of having status.
Right. How did their role change over time?
Yeah.
And eventually, why did it just fade away? The really amazing thing, the thread through it all, is how much say they had over who became prime minister.
The biggest job in government.
Exactly. All without a single line in the Constitution giving them that power. It's kind of mind-boggling.
It really is. And at its core, their most consistent and crucial job was advising the emperor, especially when a cabinet resigned and a new prime minister was needed.
And the key was the emperor listened.
That's the thing. The emperor almost always accepted their recommendation. So their collective view basically was the decision on who led the government next.
So less like wise old advisors just giving thoughts and more like the ultimate gatekeepers for the top job.
For the PM spot, absolutely.
Right.
But their influence went further than just that. They were also brought in on major policy decisions, foreign policy, domestic stuff.
Like what? Any big examples?
Yeah, the source material mentions their involvement in things like negotiating the Anglo-Japanese alliance, a huge deal.
Wow, okay.
And even the decision to go to war with Russia in 1904, their opinions mattered because of their history, their standing, and that direct line of trust with the emperor. And on top of this group role, the individual Genrou were still powerful players themselves, active in court politics, parliament, parties, even keeping ties with the military. It added another layer to how they operated.
But I keep coming back to this. How did they have this power with no legal basis? It feels like it shouldn't work.
That's where it gets really interesting, and it kind of shows how unique Japan's political system was then. The Genrou as an institution had zero basis in law.
Zero.
Absolutely none. No laws, no official rules saying what their powers were, who qualified, how they operated. People even pointed this out back around 1900.
So how did someone become a Genrou then, if there were no rules?
Well, it sort of evolved. Recognition started coming through imperial command or decree, but even those weren't consistent. The wording changed. The content varied.
Yeah.
And some guys, like Saigo Tsugumichi, were basically treated as Genrou, acted like Genrou, without ever getting one of those specific decrees. The source suggests the real keys were getting the emperor's approval and, crucially, the nod from the existing Genrou members.
So it was like joining an exclusive club, but the club made its own rules, and the emperor had the final say.
Kind of, yeah. And they did get formal treatment eventually, like in court ceremonies,
Yeah.
They had a specific seating order. But here's the ironic part. The formal decree about special treatment for distinguished service, that's Bonshange, Ginshugu, it was only properly codified in 1926.
Why not?
Well, by then, some of the key figures it was supposed to honor were already dead. It basically formalized a status that was already history for the early guys.
Okay, terminology check. You mentioned Genshi. How is that different from Genrou?
Good question. Genshu is different from the Genrou of the Council of Elders, which was an earlier actual government body in the Meiji period.
Right.
Genku came first. It means something like figures of distinguished service, often referring to the leaders of the Meiji Restoration. Genshu started being used a bit later, maybe more broadly at first. It sometimes covered people who didn't get that specific Genshu Yugi decree, but it really captured the idea of these influential elder statesmen, especially in their role advising the emperor.
Got it. So how did this system, this informal club of distinguished old guys, actually start and get such a hold on power?
Its roots go right back to the beginning of the Meiji government. After the Restoration in 1868, real power was held by these key figures, the Genku, mostly from the clans that won, like Choshu and Satsuma, but also others important in setting up the new government.
And many of these early guys became the Genrou later.
Exactly. Many of the early leaders, the Sangi or counselors, they formed the pool from which the Genrou emerged.
Okay, so then the cabinet system starts in 1885. How did PM selection work then?
At first it was simpler. The outgoing prime minister just recommended who should follow him. But a key moment was in 1889. An imperial decree gave that special treatment for distinguished service status to Ito Hirobumi and Kuroda Kiyotaka.
Ah, so that formalized it.
Well, yes and no. It looked like formal recognition, but the source points out that other key people, like Inuikaru and Matsukata Masayoshi, were already being consulted on who should be PM before they got similar decrees.
Oh, okay.
So the decree sort of acknowledged a status that was already emerging, but the practice of consultation was there first. The term genko did become more common after that decree, though. But the real precedent, the moment that locked in their collective power, came during a political crisis in 1892. The first Matsukata cabinet fell apart.
Right.
So a meeting was called. Ito, Kuroda, Yamagata, Aritomo, Matsukata were there, and Inoue was consulted by letter. This group decided Ito should be the next PM. That led to the second Ito cabinet.
And this wasn't just friends chatting, you're saying?
No, this was significant. It showed that these top Gensho figures, because of their status and the emperor's trust, could basically step in when there was a political vacuum and decide who led the government. It set a really powerful precedent for this informal group advising the emperor on PMs.
And that's when the term Genrou really takes hold.
Yes, pretty much. The terms Ornor and Oju conference start showing up regularly in newspapers and official talk from about late 1896 onwards, coinciding specifically with picking the second Matsukata cabinet.
So the system becomes more public, more recognized.
Exactly. It shifted from just, scattered consultations with important Genshu to a recognized, albeit informal, Genrou conference system.
So who are the main players in this core group that formed?
The key figures usually identified as Genrou are Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo, Kuroda Kiyotaka, Inoue Kaoru, Matsukata Masayoshi, Saigo Tsukumichi, and Shama Iwa.
A powerful list. Any internal dynamics? Factions?
Oh, definitely. Ito and Yamagata, both from the Chushu domain, were probably the most dominant, but they often had different ideas. Ito leaned more towards party politics later on, while Yamagata was more linked with the bureaucracy and the military.
The classic divide.
And the others, Matsukata, Kuroda, Saigu, Shama, they were associated with the Satsuma domain. The source even notes that Hyam was sort of sidelined for a bit after Kuroda and Saigu died.
Why?
Possibly to keep a balance between the Chushu and Satsuma factions within the group. So yeah, their internal relationships and rivalries were a big part of the political landscape.
And this leads into the Katsura Saionji era.
Absolutely. For a good stretch, the prime ministership basically bounced back and forth between Katsura Taro, who was Yamagata's protege, and Saionji Kinmochi, who was closer to Ito's line.
And again, you pick them each time.
Pretty much managed the transitions, yes. This really cemented the Genrou's role in PM selection as standard practice, even though it still had no legal basis, and the press often criticized it as, undemocratic or non-constitutional.
It's telling that Katsura himself wanted that status later.
It is. He eventually got the Distinguished Service Decree, showing how important even that informal recognition had become.
Now, the outline mentions the Taishu political crisis in 1912 as a real flashpoint for the Genrou. What went down?
That was a major challenge to their authority. The second Saionji cabinet collapsed because the army minister resigned, demanding more army divisions, which the cabinet wouldn't approve. Yamagata was seen as behind this move.
Okay.
Then the Genrou met, and they chose Katsura, Yamagata's guy, as the successor. This just looked like Yamagata installing his favorite. The public and the media erupted. There was huge criticism aimed right at the Genrou and especially at Yamagata.
So even with all their informal power, they weren't untouchable?
Not immune to public pressure, no. And what's insightful here is what happened next. Yamagata actually pushed hard to bring Saionji into the Genrou group.
Why? To quell the criticism?
That seems likely. It was probably a strategic move to make the group look broader, more legitimate, by including Saionji, who was seen as more sympathetic to party politics. Saionji got a slightly different imperial decree around this time, asking him to assist me, which basically confirmed his new status within the group.
So adding Saionji was kind of adapting to survive the political storm?
Yeah, it shows the system could be flexible, even without formal rules. Interestingly, Saionji himself argued then for moving towards a British-style system, where the majority party leader forms the government.
But the others rejected that.
Yes, the other Genrou, particularly Yamagata, didn't think Japan was ready for that.
The source says picking the second Shuma cabinet in 1914 was also really tough.
It sounds like it was chaos. After the previous cabinet fell due to a scandal, the Genrou really struggled. The source says they had 7 meetings trying to pick someone.
7? Wow.
Yeah. And Saionji actually stayed away deliberately, apparently still feeling the heat from the 1912 crisis. Getting the remaining guys to agree was clearly hard. Yamagata eventually, maybe reluctantly, suggested Kuma Shigenobu, and he formed the cabinet.
And Kuma tried to push back against the Genrou's influence, him and his foreign minister.
Yes, Kuma, and especially his foreign minister, Kato Takaaki, they tried to operate more independently. Like with the 21 demands on China, they didn't really keep Yamagata fully in the loop.
Risky move.
It backfired somewhat. When the negotiations were seen as a diplomatic failure, the media didn't just blame the cabinet. They blamed the Genrou conference too. So even if they weren't consulted, they could still get hit with the criticism.
It really sounds like Saionji's importance was growing through all this.
It definitely was. From around 1914, the source shows Saionji started to work very closely with Hara Takashi, the leader of the Seiyukai party.
What was their plan?
Kind of a division of labor. Saionji, as a Genrou, would handle things within the imperial court, manage the establishment figures. Hara would manage the party politics, the public side.
Interesting.
And Saionji was key in selecting the Chirachi cabinet in 1916. Many historians see this period as when Saionji was really fully accepted by the other Genrou as one of them.
Okay. And you mentioned Shuma maybe getting Genrou-like status.
Yeah, the source notes that after Shuma left office, he received similar treatment to a former PM who was also a Genrou. Some interpreted this as potentially elevating him to that status, but it's a bit debated, not as clear-cut as the others.
So the group is established, it weathers storms, Saionji rises, but then the outline says it basically becomes a one-man show. How did that happen?
Well, a key step towards that was the Hara cabinet, formed in 1918. Both Saionji and the powerful Yamagata agreed on Hara, and Hara was smart. He gained Yamagata's trust by pursuing stable policies mainly. But also, there was this thing called the court incident, a dispute about the crown prince's engagement. Hara strongly backed Yamagata and Matsukata when they came under attack from the right wing and parts of the public over it. That really helped protect their status and cemented Yamagata's support for Hara's government.
So alliances and mutual support were key to keeping the system working.
Absolutely. But the transition to just one Genrou was ultimately just biology. Time caught up with them. Yamagata died in 1922, Matsukata in 1924. Kuma also passed away,
Leaving only Saionji.
Exactly. Seiji Kimushi was the only active member left from that core group. So from the mid-1920s for about 15 years when people said the Genrou, they essentially meant Saionji, and he felt that responsibility heavily, advising the emperor on politics.
Did anyone try to bring new people in? Replenish the ranks?
There were moves that hinted at it. Back in 1922, when Saionji was sick, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, that's Maikino Nobuaki, basically the emperor's top advisor on court matters, he didn't just consult Matsukata, the only other Genrou around then.
Who else did he talk to?
He brought in former PM Yamamoto Ganbei and the president of the Privy Council, Kiura Kaigo. They consulted on picking the next PM, creating this sort of quasi-Genrou situation.
How did Saionji feel about that?
Not happy, apparently. The source says he was quite displeased and worked with the next Lord Keeper, Harada Tsusuke, to make sure the consultation process went back to just the Genrou, meaning just him. But this period also saw an important procedural change. Lord Keeper Harada started a practice where the emperor consulted the Lord Keeper first.
Ah, okay.
Then the Lord Keeper would go and consult the Genrou, Saionji, before taking the recommendation back to the emperor. This effectively gave the Lord Keeper a formal role in the process, working alongside the Genrou.
Which brings us to that big question historians debate.
Oh.
Why didn't Saionji just appoint new Genrou himself?
Exactly. Why let it dwindle to one? There are two main theories. One, pushed by people like the commentator Yoshino Sakuzi and some historians, is that Saionji deliberately didn't appoint successors because he saw the Genrou system itself as outdated, not constitutional, and he wanted it to basically die out with him, a conscious phasing out.
And the other theory?
The other view, argued by scholars like Ito Yukio, is that it wasn't necessarily intentional phasing out, but more a lack of suitable candidates. People who had the right mix of political experience, closeness to the emperor, and, crucially, shared Saionji's moderate political values.
So maybe the pool of trusted successors was just too small.
Possibly. The source does mention figures like Hara or Karitaka Aki, the foreign minister under Kuma, as people who might have become Genrou if they hadn't died relatively young. It suggests Saionji's standards or preferences limited the options.
So whether by design or just circumstance, the system ends up resting on one man's shoulders. How did things play out in Saionji's last years, and how did the whole thing finally end?
Well, in the mid-1920s, something interesting happened that actually seemed to stabilize things for a bit. Saionji started this practice. He would usually recommend the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives as the next prime minister.
Like the British system he'd suggested earlier.
Getting closer, yes. Or, if the majority party had problems, maybe the leader of the second party. This wasn't law, but it became such a regular thing, a norm, that people started calling it the Constitutional Convention, Kashi no Ju. Did Saionji call it that? Apparently not. He didn't use the term himself. But the practice made the PM selection seem more connected to elections and parliament, which actually reduced the criticism of the Genrou system for a while.
Sounds like a step towards more party-based government.
It looked that way. But civilian party rule was under huge pressure. You had economic problems, political scandals, public trust was eroding, and crucially, the military was getting much, much stronger.
While Saionji was getting older.
Exactly. Emperor Hirohito was still relatively young. Court officials like the Lord Keeper didn't have the same historical, political clout as the original Genrou, and Saionji himself was elderly, living more quietly away from Tokyo. His ability to actively push back was limited.
So even if he disagreed with the military, like with the Manchurian incident in 31...
Right. He personally opposed actions like that, but the military increasingly just did what it wanted, and the government and the court didn't, or couldn't, respond forcefully enough. This just emboldened the military further and weakened the influence of everyone else, the Genrou, the court, the party cabinets.
The fall of the Wakatsuki cabinet in 1931 seems like a clear turning point then.
It really was. That cabinet resigned under pressure to form a cooperation cabinet, basically meaning giving the military more say. Some court officials were leaning that way, but Saionji, he dug his heels in.
He insisted on a party leader.
Yes. He recommended Inukai Tsuyoshi from the Seiyukai party, and his recommendations stuck the Inukai for party politics, maybe.
But only temporary, given what happened next.
Tragically temporary. The May 15th incident in 1932. Prime Minister Inukai assassinated by young naval officers who hated party government. It was a massive shock.
A direct attack on the political system.
Absolutely. It showed the military, or elements within it, were willing to use violence to get their way. In the chaos afterwards, Saionji had to navigate carefully. He held incredibly broad consultations, not just ex-PMs, but ministers, military leaders, court officials, everyone.
And who did he pick?
After all that, he recommended Navy Admiral Saito Makoto. The idea was a national unity cabinet, bringing in bureaucrats, non-party figures, trying to find someone who could manage the incredibly tense situation. Though figures on the right, like Hironuma Kiyoshi, were apparently unhappy with the choice.
It sounds like his focus shifted to protecting the emperor and the court itself.
Very much so. After May 15, protecting the emperor and the moderate officials around him seemed paramount. Saionji took steps like, in 1933, formally limiting the Lord Keeper's ability to act independently in the selection process, making sure it went through him. He also introduced that Council of Senior Statesmen.
What was that?
Basically gathering former PMs and the Privy Council president to consult alongside him. It was probably an effort to share the burden, create a broader front for the recommendations, and shield the key court figures from direct political attacks.
But then came the February 26th incident in 1936. Even worse violence.
Devastating. Another military coup attempt, and this one specifically targeted those moderate court officials close to the emperor, the ones Saionji relied on. Lord Keeper Saisho was killed. Chamberlain Suzuki Kantaru was badly wounded. Former Lord Keeper Makino was targeted too.
So the process was thrown into chaos again.
Completely. The Lord Keeper was dead. The president of the Privy Council had to step in temporarily. And initially, they actually started consulting without Saionji.
Really? Bypassing him?
Briefly, yeah. He was brought back into it eventually. Prince Konoe Fumimaro was the first choice, but declined. So Saionji ended up recommending Hirota Koki.
This really shows the military targeting the Genrous network, doesn't it? And their power to just obstruct became clear soon after.
Undeniably. The attempt to form a cabinet under General Ugaki Kazunari in 1937 was the final nail in the coffin for the Genrou's effective power, you could say.
What happened?
Saionji recommended Ugaki, thinking maybe a general could control the army. But the Army High Command just flat out refused to cooperate. They wouldn't nominate an army minister to serve in Ugaki's cabinet.
Or without an army minister?
Ugaki couldn't form a government. It was constitutionally required. Saionji and the emperor were unwilling to force a confrontation with the army, fearing it would fail and damage the emperor's authority even more. So Ugaki had to give up.
So the military basically had a veto now?
In practice, yes. Just by refusing to participate, they could block the whole process. This failure really showed the limits of Saionji's influence. After that, he largely withdrew from being the primary selector. He told the Lord Keeper he wouldn't be the main recommender anymore.
So the responsibility formally shifted.
Effectively, yes. It passed to the Lord Keeper, who was Yuasa Kurohei at that time. By 1939, the official line was that the Lord Keeper made the recommendation on his own responsibility. Saionji was just consulted, like a senior advisor providing input.
A shadow of his former role.
Pretty much. There was a brief revival of using a broader senior statesman conference under Lord Keeper Kidokuchi in 1940, but Saionji's active role was done. The source notes his last quiet act of resistance, though.
What was that?
In 1940, when Prince Kanoa was recommended again, Saionji refused to give his formal agreement. He was deeply disappointed with the way things were going, with the drift towards war. His refusal didn't stop the appointment, but it was a final, silent protest.
So the Genrou system had really withered away even before he died?
Fundamentally, yes. The military's rise, the Lord Keeper taking over the formal recommendation role, these had already hollowed out its function. The system officially ended only when Saionji Kinmochi passed away on December 24th, 1940.
Okay, so we've taken quite a deep dive there into the Genrou of Imperial Japan.
We have. A really unique institution, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Informal, outside the law, born from these larger-than-life restoration figures.
Which somehow ended up holding immense power, especially over choosing the country's leader for decades.
Right, and we saw how it evolved from that group of Genka, became a recognized system, faced crises, public anger.
Then narrowed down until it basically rested on just one man, Saionji.
Before finally losing its grip as the military took over and civilian politics weakened, dissolving completely when Saionji died.
So key takeaways for you listening. Their power wasn't from law books, it was from prestige, imperial trust, political skill.
Yeah, and picking PMs was the big one. But they influenced major policies too. And its decline wasn't like flipping a switch. It was a gradual fading as military power surged.
And why does understanding this matter now? Why should you care about this historical deep dive?
Well, because it's just a fascinating look at how power can work completely outside the formal rules. It shows the strength, maybe, but also the real fragility of relying on informal influence, especially in times of crisis or when facing organized challenges like the military.
It shows how huge decisions can end up being shaped by just a handful of unelected people working through personal connections and historical status.
Exactly.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? The generous system, okay, it was tied to a very specific time and place and those specific individuals in Japan. But that core idea, critical state decisions being heavily influenced, maybe even effectively made, by a small, unelected group operating informally. Could you see similar dynamics playing out today, just in different forms? Are there modern Genrou, maybe hidden behind titles like senior advisors or within powerful think tanks or just informal networks of influence? Or was this whole phenomenon truly unique to that pre-war Japanese context? Something to definitely think about.